The frozen English countryside stretched beneath a blanket of pre-dawn darkness as Second Lieutenant Charles Cally Brown walked across the tarmac at RAF Kimballton, the 20th of December 1943, just 5 days before Christmas. The 21-year-old farm boy from Weston, West Virginia, pulled his leather flight jacket tighter against the bitter cold that cut through to his bones. Around him, the massive shadows of B-17 flying fortresses loomed like sleeping giants, their aluminum skin glistening with frost in the dim light of the airfield. This was his first combat mission as aircraft commander. Charlie had lied to his crew, telling them he was 25 to inspire confidence. In truth, he was barely old enough to vote, thrust into command of 9 other young men whose lives now rested in his hands. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him heavier than any flight suit. The briefing room had been packed with air crews, cigarette smoke hanging thick in the air as intelligence officers unveiled the day's target. The Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft production facility in Bremen, Germany. The room had gone quiet when they mentioned the defences, more than 250 flak guns protecting the city, plus an unknown number of German fighters. Bremen was one of the most heavily defended targets in the Third Reich. The officers called it a maximum effort mission. 546 heavy bombers would participate in the raid, the largest force assembled to date. Charlie found his crew gathered near their bomber, serial number 42 to 3167, which they had christened Ye Olde Pub. The name had been painted on the nose alongside cartoon artwork of a foaming beer mug, a bit of levity in the face of death. His men were a collection of American youth from every corner of the country. Second Lieutenant Spencer Pinky Luke, his co-pilot from somewhere in the Midwest, whose baby face made him look even younger than Charlie. Second Lieutenant Albert Doc Sadok, the navigator, a thoughtful man who kept a photo of his sweetheart tucked in his flight suit. Second Lieutenant Robert Andy Andrews, pulling double duty as bombardier and radio operator. Then there were the gunners, the backbone of their defense. Staff Sergeant Bertrand Frenchy Coulombe, their flight engineer and top turret gunner, whose thick New England accent reminded everyone of home. Sergeant Richard Dick Peshow at the radio. Sergeant Lloyd Jennings manning the left waist gun. Sergeant Alex Russian Yelasanko at the right waist gun, the oldest of the crew at 29. Staff Sergeant Samuel Blackie Blackford squeezed into the ball turret beneath the plane, and Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, their tail gunner, the smallest and quietest of them all, with a perpetually sad face that looked melancholy even when he smiled. Charlie had found Eckie pacing outside the night before, unable to sleep. The young man from the hills of central Pennsylvania had seemed to sense something, some premonition perhaps. They had talked briefly under the stars, Charlie trying to reassure him, though his own stomach churned with anxiety. As they performed their pre-flight checks in the freezing darkness, Charlie noticed his hands trembling not from the cold, but from the knowledge of what lay ahead. The mission planners had initially assigned them to Purple Heart Corner, the most vulnerable position on the edge of the bomber formation where German fighters typically focused their attacks. Only a last-minute mechanical failure in another bomber had moved them up to a slightly safer position in the formation. The engines coughed to life one by one, each of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines roaring with 1,200 horsepower. The sound was deafening, drowning out thought and fear alike. As they taxied to the runway, Charlie could see the silhouettes of other bombers lined up in the darkness, their navigation lights creating a string of red and green jewels against the black English morning. At 0830 hours, Charlie pushed the throttles forward. Ye Olde Pub, laden with 12 500-pound bombs and thousands of rounds of ammunition, slowly gathered speed down the runway. The bomber seemed reluctant to leave the earth, requiring nearly the entire length of the runway before Charlie pulled back on the yoke and felt the wheels leave the ground. They climbed into the dark sky, joining the aerial armada forming above the English countryside, 225 bombers in their element alone, part of the first wave heading for Bremen. As they crossed the English Channel, the sun finally began to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Charlie of autumn mornings on his family's farm. But this wasn't West Virginia, and the beauty of the sunrise couldn't mask the danger ahead. Below them, the cold grey waters of the North Sea stretched endlessly, a grave marker for countless airmen who never made it home. The formation crossed into enemy airspace over the Dutch coast. Charlie could feel the tension ratchet up among his crew. Everyone was at their positions now, searching the sky for the first sign of German fighters. The temperature at their altitude of 27,000 feet was -60 degrees Celsius. Ice formed on everything, the windows, the guns, even their eyebrows beneath their oxygen masks. Every breath was visible in the frigid air, and the cold seemed to penetrate through their heated flight suits, electrically warmed boots, and thick gloves. "Pilot to crew," Charlie called over the intercom, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Stay alert. We're approaching the initial point. Flak expected in 5 minutes." The bomber stream stretched for 8 miles, an aluminum river in the sky heading toward Germany's industrial heart. Each plane maintained precise formation, wingtips sometimes mere feet apart, creating a defensive box bristling with 50 caliber machine guns. It was a sight both beautiful and terrible American industrial might personified, carrying death to the Third Reich. As they approached Bremen, Charlie could see the first black puffs of flak beginning to appear ahead, like deadly flowers blooming in the morning sky. This was what they had trained for, what they had crossed an ocean to do. But no amount of training could truly prepare someone for what was about to unfold over Germany that cold December morning. In just minutes, their lives would change forever, though none of them could imagine that their story would become one of the most extraordinary tales of humanity to emerge from the carnage of World War II. The first burst of flak exploded off their starboard wing with a sound like thunder, close enough that Charlie could feel the concussion shake the entire aircraft. Black smoke filled with lethal shrapnel blossomed around them as Ye Olde Pub entered the storm of anti-aircraft fire protecting Bremen. The German 88mm guns below were firing in predetermined box patterns, filling sections of sky with explosive shells designed to tear bombers apart. "Pilot to bombardier," Charlie called to Andy Andrews. "We're on the bomb run. You have the aircraft." This was the most vulnerable moment of any mission, 10 minutes of straight and level flight while the bombardier lined up his Norden bomb sight on the target. No evasive maneuvers allowed, no matter how intense the flak became. They were sitting ducks at 27,300 feet, maintaining exactly 155 miles per hour, while below them German gun crews fed shell after shell into their weapons. The explosions intensified, each burst closer than the last. Charlie gripped the control yoke with white knuckles, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to take evasive action. Through the plexiglass nose, he could see other B-17 seconds in their formation taking hits, black smoke streaming from engines, pieces of aluminum skin peeling away like paper in a hurricane. Then their luck ran out. The first direct hit came without warning. A German 88mm shell exploded directly beneath their nose, sending razor-sharp fragments tearing through the aircraft's thin aluminum skin. The plexiglass nose cone shattered into 1,000 pieces, instantly transforming the bombardier's compartment into a wind tunnel of 200 mile-per-hour frozen air. Andy Andrews was thrown backward, blood streaming from multiple wounds, his bombardier's equipment destroyed. Before Charlie could react, another explosion rocked the aircraft. The number 2 engine on the port wing erupted in flames and smoke, the propeller windmilling uselessly. Charlie immediately hit the engine's fire suppression system and feathered the prop to reduce drag, but they were already beginning to fall behind the formation. "Pilot to crew, we've lost number 2, Charlie announced, fighting to maintain control as the asymmetric thrust tried to pull them into a deadly spiral. The number 4 engine on the starboard wing was also running rough, forcing Charlie to throttle it back to prevent it from tearing itself apart. "Bombs away!" Andrews managed to shout over the intercom, his voice tight with pain. Ye Olde Pub lurched upward as 6,000 pounds of high explosives fell toward the Focke-Wulf factory below. Their job was done, but their ordeal was just beginning. With only 2 engines at full power and struggling to maintain altitude, Ye Olde Pub could no longer keep pace with the formation. Charlie watched helplessly as the protective box of bombers pulled away, leaving them alone in the hostile sky. It was every bomber crew's nightmare becoming a straggler, isolated and vulnerable. The German fighters found them within minutes. "Bandits! Bandits! 12 o'clock high!" Frenchy Coulomb shouted from the top turret. Charlie looked up to see a swarm of Messerschmitt Bef 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds diving toward them like hawks on a wounded pigeon. The fighters came in from the front, their 20mm cannons winking with deadly light. The first pass was devastating. Cannon shells punched through Ye Olde Pub's fuselage like it was made of cardboard, each impact creating holes the size of dinner plates. The instrument panel in front of Charlie exploded in a shower of sparks and glass. Something hot struck his right shoulder shrapnel from a 20mm shell, and he felt warm blood beginning to soak through his flight suit. "Tail gunner to pilot," Ecky's voice crackled over the intercom. "They're coming around for another—" The transmission cut off abruptly. In the tail section, Hugh Eckenrode never saw the cannon shell that killed him. The 20mm round struck him directly, killing him instantly. His twin 50 caliber guns fell silent, the tail position now a gaping hole exposing the aircraft's interior to the sub-zero slipstream. Blood froze instantly in the -60 air, forming grotesque red icicles over the abandoned guns. The German fighters pressed their attack relentlessly. They came in waves 2, 3, 4 at a time from every angle. Charlie could hear his gunners firing back, the staccato rhythm of the 50 calibers vibrating through the aircraft's frame. Frenchy Coulomb in the top turret was swiveling frantically, trying to track multiple targets at once. In the ball turret, Blackie Blackford rotated his cramped sphere, firing at fighters as they flashed past beneath the bomber. Another explosion, this time the number 3 engine took a direct hit. It didn't catch fire, but Charlie could see oil streaming from the cowling, and the engine was producing barely half power. They were flying on essentially 1.5 engines now, altitude bleeding away with every passing second. Dick Pachout, the radio operator, screamed over the intercom. A cannon shell had exploded next to his position, sending fragments into his face and destroying the radio equipment. Blood poured from his left eye, and he couldn't see whether the eye itself was still there. In the waist positions, both gunners were hit. Alex Yelesanko took shrapnel in his leg, the hot metal tearing through muscle and lodging against bone. He collapsed onto the floor of the aircraft, his blood pooling and freezing on the metal deck. Lloyd Jennings tried to help him while still manning his gun, but there was little he could do. The morphine syrettes in their first aid kit had frozen solid in the extreme cold. Down in the ball turret, Blackie Blackford's situation was desperate. The heating wires in his flight suit had shorted out when fragments peppered his position. His feet were beginning to freeze in his boots, the numbness creeping up his legs. He kept firing, but his movements were becoming sluggish as hypothermia set in. The fighters kept coming 10, 12, 15 of them, taking turns making passes at the dying bomber. The entire aircraft was being systematically destroyed. The horizontal stabilizer on the port side was shot away, along with half the rudder. The hydraulic system was gone, amber fluid spraying and freezing throughout the fuselage. The electrical system failed next, leaving them without instruments, without communication between crew positions, without anything but basic mechanical controls. Charlie fought the controls with every ounce of strength he had, but the B-17 was becoming impossible to fly. With asymmetric thrust from the failing engines and massive damage to the control surfaces, Ye Olde Pub began to roll inverted. The horizon disappeared from view, replaced by the sickening sight of the German countryside above them, where the sky should be. The oxygen system had been severed by cannon fire. At 24,000 feet, Charlie began to lose consciousness, his vision tunneling to black as hypoxia set in. His last coherent thought was that he had failed his crew, failed his country, failed in his very first mission. The bomber entered a flat spin, spiraling toward the earth like a massive metal coffin. But B-17 seconds were called flying fortresses for a reason. They were built to take punishment that would destroy lesser aircraft. Even with catastrophic damage, even with her pilot unconscious, Ye Olde Pub refused to die. As the bomber fell through 3,000 feet, the thicker air revived Charlie. He opened his eyes to see houses and trees rushing up at terrifying speed. They were over the German city of Oldenburg, seconds from impact. Operating on pure instinct and adrenaline, Charlie hauled back on the control yoke with both hands, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest. The B-17 groaned, her damaged structure protesting the enormous G-forces as Charlie fought to pull out of the dive. At barely 500 feet above the rooftops, Ye Olde Pub leveled out, her remaining engines coughing and sputtering. Charlie's hands were shaking uncontrollably now. Whether from cold, shock, or adrenaline, he couldn't tell. He looked around at what was left of his aircraft. Through the holes blown in the fuselage, he could see the German countryside below. The entire nose section was gone, turned into a 200 mile-per-hour wind tunnel. Behind him, he could hear wounded men moaning, the metallic smell of blood mixed with the acrid stench of burned electrical systems and leaking hydraulic fluid. They were still 250 miles from England, flying barely above stall speed at less than 1,000 feet altitude, in broad daylight over enemy territory. They had perhaps one functioning engine, no navigation instruments, no radio, and most of the crew wounded or dead. By all rights, they should have been finished. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler stood on the frozen ground of the Luftwaffe airfield near Oldenburg, watching his ground crew work frantically to repair his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. The 28-year-old fighter ace was frustrated. An American .50 caliber bullet had lodged itself in his fighter's radiator during the morning's combat, forcing him to break off his attack and land for repairs. It had already been a successful morning. He had shot down 2 B-17 seconds, bringing his total to 27 aerial victories. Just 3 more kills, and he would be eligible for the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military honours. But for Franz, the medal meant something more than recognition. It represented validation that there was purpose in this terrible war, that the destruction he witnessed daily, the flattened cities, the burning homes, the countless dead served some greater meaning. He had seen what Allied bombers had done to Hamburg, where entire neighbourhoods had been incinerated in firestorms that consumed everything in their path. He had watched Bremen burn just this morning as hundreds of American bombers dropped their deadly cargo. Franz Stigler was not a typical Nazi warrior. Born in Regensburg, Bavaria, his father had been a World War I pilot and observer who had raised his sons with a strict code of honour. Franz had initially studied to become a Catholic priest before discovering his passion for flying. He had joined Lufthansa, Germany's civilian airline, as a pilot before the war, flying routes across Europe in the peaceful years before the world descended into madness. When war came, Franz had resisted joining the fighter force. He wanted only to train other pilots, to pass on his skills without having to kill. But then his beloved older brother August, also a pilot, died in a flying accident in 1940, his Junkers Ju-88 crashing during a routine flight. The loss had devastated Franz, and grief had transformed into anger into a desire for purpose. He finally agreed to join the frontline squadrons. Franz had learned his deadly craft in the scorching skies over North Africa, flying with Jägergeschwader 27, the famed Afrika Wing. There he had served under some of the Luftwaffe's most legendary aces, including Hans Joachim Marseille, the Star of Africa, who had scored 158 victories before his death. But more importantly, he had served under Gustav Rodel, a commander who had impressed upon his pilots a code of chivalrous conduct even in the midst of total war. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute," Rodel had told them, "I will shoot you myself. We are fighter pilots first, last, always. We are not executioners." Those words had stayed with Franz through all his battles, through North Africa, through Sicily, through the desperate defense of the Reich. Even as the war became increasingly brutal, as cities burned and civilians died by the thousands, Franz tried to maintain some semblance of honor, some belief that he was a warrior, not a murderer. Now, as he supervised the repair of his fighter, Franz heard the distinctive sound of damaged aircraft engines, a syncopated, coughing rhythm that any experienced pilot recognized as a death rattle. He looked up to see a lone B-17 flying fortress limping across the sky at barely 1,000 feet altitude, trailing smoke, flying so slowly it seemed impossible it was still airborne. Franz's ground crew stopped their work to stare. The bomber was heading south, deeper into Germany rather than toward the coast and escape. It was clearly lost, its crew probably dead or dying, the aircraft flying on little more than momentum and prayer. Here was an easy kill, a sitting duck that would bring Franz one step closer to his Knight's Cross. Without hesitation, Franz climbed into his partially repaired Bf 109. The engine roared to life, and despite the crew chief's protests about the damaged radiator, Franz released the brakes and accelerated down the runway. The Messerschmitt leaped into the air, its supercharged Daimler-Benz engine pulling it skyward with predatory grace. Franz spotted the wounded bomber immediately. It was flying so slowly that he had to throttle back significantly to avoid overshooting it. He approached from behind and below, the classic attack position, lining up his gun sight on the B-17's tail section. His finger moved to the trigger for his two 20mm MG 151 cannons. One short burst would be enough to send the bomber spiraling to earth. But as Franz closed to firing range, he noticed something odd. The tail guns weren't moving. No defensive fire came from any of the bomber's positions. As he drew closer, Franz could see why the entire tail section had been blown apart. Through the gaping holes in the fuselage, he could see directly into the aircraft's interior. What he saw there changed everything. The tail gunner was clearly dead, his blood frozen in grotesque icicles. But Franz could see other crew members, some wounded and bleeding, others struggling to help their injured comrades. One man was trying to tie a tourniquet around another's leg with hands that shook from cold and shock. Another airman was slumped against the fuselage, holding what appeared to be his eye. These weren't the enemies he had been trained to hate, these were boys, young men like himself, frightened and dying, trying desperately to make it home. Franz pulled his fighter alongside the B-17's fuselage, close enough to see into the cockpit. The pilot was fighting the controls, his face pale with blood loss, his flight suit soaked red from a shoulder wound. The co-pilot was helping him, both men putting all their strength into keeping the dying aircraft aloft. Franz could see the determination in their eyes, the refusal to give up even when all hope was gone. In that moment, Franz Stigler faced the kind of decision that defines a man's character forever. Everything in his military training, everything in his duty as a German officer, demanded that he destroy this enemy bomber. These Americans had just dropped bombs on German cities, had possibly killed German civilians. His own comrades on the ground were watching, expecting him to finish the kill. But Gustav Rodel's words echoed in his mind, "We are fighter pilots, not executioners." Looking at the wounded Americans struggling to survive, Franz saw not enemies but fellow airmen, young men caught in the same terrible machinery of war that had claimed his brother, that had destroyed so much of what he once held dear. These men in their shattered bomber were no longer combatants. They were as helpless as men in parachutes, perhaps more so. Their aircraft could barely fly, their defensive guns were silent, most of them were wounded. To shoot them down now wouldn't be combat, it would be murder. Franz made his decision. Instead of opening fire, he pulled his Bf 109 closer to the B-17, flying in tight formation just off the bomber's port wing. Through his canopy, he could see the American pilot notice him, could see the terror in the young man's eyes as he waited for the cannon shells that would end everything. But the shells never came. Instead, Franz began gesturing frantically, trying to communicate with hand signals. He pointed downward, toward the ground, then made a motion with his hands indicating landing. He was trying to tell them to land at a German airfield, to surrender. They would become prisoners of war, but they would receive medical treatment and survive. The American pilot shook his head. Whether from inability to understand or refusal to surrender, Franz couldn't tell. The bomber continued its slow, agonizing flight toward the west. Franz tried again, this time pointing toward the north, toward Sweden. If they could make it to neutral Sweden, they would be interned but safe, able to receive medical care and sit out the rest of the war. Again, the American pilot either couldn't understand or wouldn't accept the suggestion. Frustrated but increasingly respectful of the Americans' determination, Franz faced another decision. He could simply fly away, leave the bomber to its fate. It would probably be shot down by flak batteries at the coast or crash in the North Sea. He had already shown mercy by not attacking, wasn't that enough? But something in Franz wouldn't let him abandon these brave men to their fate. If they insisted on trying to make it home, he would help them get there. It was insane. It was treasonous. It could cost him his life if discovered, but it was the right thing to do. Franz Stigler made a choice that could have signed his death warrant. Pulling his Messerschmitt Bluff 109 into tight formation with the crippled American bomber, he positioned himself on Ye Olde Pub's port wing, so close that Charlie Brown could see every detail of the German fighter, the yellow nose marking of JG-27, the mottled grey camouflage, even the victory marks painted on the rudder indicating Franz's 27 kills. Charlie Brown's mind reeled with confusion and terror. The German fighter was flying mere meters from his wingtip, close enough that any sudden movement could cause a collision. Charlie could see the enemy pilot clearly through the canopy, a lean face with intense eyes, looking not at him but ahead, toward the west, toward the German coast that lay between them and the open sea. In the top turret, Frenchy Coulomb tracked the German fighter with his twin 50 caliber guns, his fingers poised on the triggers. One squeeze and he could pour deadly fire into the Messerschmitt at point-blank range. But Charlie, recognizing something inexplicable in the German pilot's behavior, made a decision that went against every instinct. "Don't shoot," he managed to croak to Frenchy, his throat dry with fear and confusion. "Nobody fire unless he fires first." The two aircraft flew on in surreal formation, predator and prey bound together in an incomprehensible dance. Franz kept gesturing, pointing repeatedly northward toward Sweden, then downward toward German airfields. His frustration was visible as the Americans continued westward, either unable or unwilling to understand his signals. What Charlie Brown couldn't know was that Franz Stigler was performing an incredible act of courage and sacrifice. By flying in formation with the American bomber, Franz was protecting it from one of the greatest threats it faced, the hundreds of German anti-aircraft guns that lined the coast. These flak batteries had standing orders to shoot down any Allied aircraft attempting to escape to England, but they wouldn't fire on a German fighter, and by flying so close to the B-17, Franz was gambling that the gun crews would hold their fire rather than risk hitting one of their own. As they approached the heavily fortified German coast near Wilhelmshaven, Franz could see the flak batteries tracking them. He knew the gun crews must be confused. Why was a German fighter escorting an enemy bomber? Were they witnessing the capture of an American aircraft being forced to land? The hesitation was all Franz needed. Not a single gun fired as the unlikely pair flew over the coastal defenses. But Franz's protection came at enormous personal risk. If any of his superiors discovered what he was doing, he would face immediate court-martial and almost certain execution. The Nazi regime had no tolerance for what they would consider treason. Even his fellow pilots, men he had served with for years, would be duty-bound to report him. Franz was literally risking everything: his life, his honor, his family's safety for men he had never met, enemies who had moments before been dropping bombs on his homeland. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the wounded crew watched in stunned disbelief. Dick Pachout, despite the agonizing pain from his destroyed eye, pressed his face against a window to stare at their unlikely guardian angel. In the waist section, Lloyd Jennings had managed to drag the severely wounded Alex Yelasanko away from the open gun position, where freezing wind threatened to kill him from exposure. Both men could see the German fighter through the gaping holes in their aircraft's fuselage. The German pilot's face was clearly visible, and what they saw there wasn't the hatred they expected from their enemy. Instead, there was something that looked almost like concern, a grim determination that matched their own desperate fight for survival. It was a humanizing moment that shattered the propaganda-fueled image of the ruthless Nazi killer they had all been taught to expect. For Franz Stigler, every minute of this escort increased his danger exponentially. Other German fighters could appear at any moment, and he would have no way to explain his actions. Radar stations were tracking them, reporting the strange sight of a Bf-109 apparently shepherding an enemy bomber toward England. With each passing mile, the chance of being discovered and facing the consequences grew. The damaged bomber could barely maintain 170 miles per hour, forcing Franz to fly at near stalling speed, his fighter wallowing awkwardly through the air. His damaged radiator was overheating, the temperature gauge climbing steadily toward the red zone. If the engine seized, he would have to bail out over the North Sea, a death sentence in December's freezing waters. As they crossed the coast and headed out over the North Sea, Franz faced yet another dilemma. How far should he escort them? Every mile further from the German coast was another mile he would have to fly back alone, in a damaged fighter, possibly running out of fuel. Yet he could see the American bomber was still struggling, still in danger of falling into the sea. Charlie Brown, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle just to keep Ye Olde Pub airborne. The controls were heavy and unresponsive, requiring both him and Pinky Luke to maintain pressure on the yoke. The aircraft wanted to roll to the left, pulled by the asymmetric drag of the dead engines. Every gust of wind threatened to flip them into an unrecoverable spin. The North Sea below was a death trap. Even if they survived ditching in the freezing water, they would die of hypothermia within minutes. Yet through all of this, Charlie couldn't stop glancing at the German fighter maintaining perfect formation just meters away. The enemy pilot's skill was undeniable. It took exceptional flying ability to maintain such close formation at such slow speeds. But more than that, it took something Charlie was only beginning to understand. It took moral courage of the highest order. They had been flying together for nearly 10 minutes when Franz finally decided they were far enough from the German coast. The American bomber, while still badly damaged, was maintaining altitude. If they could keep it in the air, they had a chance of making it the 250 miles to England. It was time for Franz to turn back. But first, Franz wanted the Americans to understand what had happened, to know that not all German pilots were the monsters of propaganda. He pulled slightly ahead of the B-17 and rocked his wings, the universal aviation signal for goodbye. Then, in a gesture that would be burned into Charlie Brown's memory forever, Franz Stigler looked directly at the American pilot and raised his hand in a clear, unmistakable salute. It was a salute between warriors, between enemies who had found respect across the divide of war, between two young men who recognized their shared humanity even in the midst of trying to kill each other. Franz held the salute for several seconds, ensuring Charlie saw and understood it, then banked his Messerschmitt away to the left in a graceful arc. Charlie Brown, despite his wounds, despite his exhaustion, despite everything, returned the salute. It was an automatic response, drilled into him from his first days in the military, but it carried a weight of meaning he wouldn't fully understand for decades to come. In that moment, the propaganda fell away, the hatred dissolved, and two human beings acknowledged each other across the vast gulf of war. Franz Stigler turned his fighter eastward, back toward Germany, back toward a war he no longer believed in, back toward comrades who would never understand what he had just done. As his Messerschmitt disappeared into the distance, Charlie Brown was left with a mystery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Who was that German pilot, and why had he spared them? The crew of Ye Olde Pub watched their unlikely saviour disappear with a mixture of relief and bewilderment. They were alone again, damaged and dying, 250 miles of hostile ocean between them and safety. But they were alive, and it was because an enemy pilot had chosen mercy over duty, humanity over hatred. Charlie Brown turned Ye Olde Pub toward England, the damaged bomber wallowing through the air like a dying whale. Without the German fighter as an inexplicable reference point, the full magnitude of their situation crashed back upon him. They were alone over the North Sea, in an aircraft that by all laws of physics shouldn't be flying, with most of the crew wounded and one man dead. The mathematics of survival were brutal. They had perhaps 1.5 functioning engines out of 4. No navigational instruments, no radio, no way to call for help, or even determine their exact position. The magnetic compass spun uselessly, damaged by the electrical failures. Charlie could only point the nose toward where he thought England should be and pray they had enough fuel and altitude to make it. Behind him in the aircraft, the crew fought their own battles for survival. Lloyd Jennings had managed to apply a makeshift tourniquet to Alex Yelesanko's shattered leg, using a belt and a broken piece of metal as a windlass. The bleeding had slowed, but Yelesanko was going into shock, his skin pale and clammy despite the freezing temperature. The morphine syrettes remained frozen solid, leaving him to endure the agony with nothing but gritted teeth and determination. In the nose section, where 200 mile-per-hour wind howled through the shattered plexiglass, Andy Andrews huddled against the blast, his wounds burning with cold. Frostbite was beginning to claim his exposed flesh, his fingers turning the telltale white of dying tissue. Doc Sadok, the navigator, tried to shield him with his own body, but there was nowhere to escape the killing wind. Dick Paychout had fashioned a crude bandage for his destroyed eye using strips torn from a parachute. Blood had frozen to his face in a grotesque mask, but he remained conscious, helping where he could despite his own agony. In the ball turret, Blackie Blackford could no longer feel his feet at all. The electrical heating system in his flight suit had failed completely, and hypothermia was slowly claiming him from the extremities inward. And in the tail section, Hugh Eckenrode, Eckenrode's body lay where he had died, frozen in the sub-zero temperature, a silent reminder of the price they had paid over Bremen. His twin 50 caliber guns pointed uselessly skyward, iced over like everything else in the aircraft's tail. For 2.5 hours, Charlie and Pinky Luke fought to keep Ye Olde Pub in the air. Their arms ached from the constant pressure needed to maintain level flight. The control cables, damaged by cannon fire, could snap at any moment. Every unexpected sound, and there were many from the dying aircraft, sent spurts of adrenaline through their exhausted bodies. Then, like a miracle, the English coast appeared through the haze. Charlie didn't know exactly where they were, somewhere over Norfolk. He guessed, but it didn't matter. They had made it to England. The relief was overwhelming, but it was immediately replaced by a new fear: how to land this dying aircraft without killing everyone on board. The hydraulic system was gone, meaning no brakes, no flaps to slow their landing speed. The landing gear would have to be cranked down manually, if it would extend at all. One tire had been shredded by flak. The control surfaces were so damaged that Charlie had only marginal authority over the aircraft's movements. Charlie spotted an airfield below RAF Seething, home to the 448th Bombardment Group. It wasn't their home base at Kimbolton, but it would have to do. They had no radio to announce their approach, no way to warn the field of their condition. Charlie could only circle once, hoping someone below would recognize their distress and clear the runway. "Crew, prepare for crash landing," Charlie announced over the intercom system that miraculously still partially functioned. "Anyone who can walk, get to crash positions. Wounded, stay where you are." Frenchy Coulomb manually cranked down the landing gear, the mechanism protesting with metallic screeches. Miraculously, all 3 gear indicated down and locked, though Charlie had no way of knowing if they would hold the weight of landing. The approach was a nightmare. Without flaps, they would have to land at nearly 150 miles per hour, far faster than normal, on a damaged tire, with no brakes to stop. Charlie fought to line up with the runway, the aircraft responding sluggishly to his inputs. The ground rushed up at them with terrifying speed. The moment of impact was violent. The damaged tire exploded immediately, sending the bomber slewing to the left. Charlie and Pinky stood on the right rudder pedal, fighting to keep them on the runway. Metal screamed against concrete as the wheel rim ground down, throwing a rooster tail of sparks behind them. Without brakes, they could only wait for friction and drag to slow them down. Ye Olde Pub finally ground to a stop just meters from the end of the runway. One wheel collapsed, the entire aircraft listing to one side like a broken bird. For a moment, nobody moved, unable to believe they had actually survived. Then the rescue crews arrived, medics, firefighters, mechanics swarming over the damaged bomber. They stopped in shock when they saw the extent of the damage. One mechanic would later count over 600 holes in the aircraft from flak and cannon fire. The fact that it had flown at all, much less made it back to England, defied explanation. The wounded were carefully extracted and rushed to the base hospital. Alex Yelasanko was immediately taken into surgery to save his leg. Dick Pehot's eye was gone, but the surgeons managed to save his sight in the other eye. Blackie Blackford's feet were severely frostbitten but would eventually recover with treatment. Charlie's shoulder wound, while painful, was relatively minor compared to what his crew had endured. Hugh Eckenrode's frozen body was removed with the reverence due a fallen warrior. At just 23 years old, he had paid the ultimate price, leaving behind a family in Pennsylvania who would receive a telegram that would shatter their Christmas. The debriefing that followed was unlike anything Charlie had experienced. Intelligence officers listened in amazement as he described the German fighter that had escorted them to safety. At first, they didn't believe him. It was too fantastic, too contrary to everything they knew about the enemy. But Charlie's crew confirmed every detail, all having witnessed the inexplicable escort. The senior intelligence officer made a decision that would keep the story secret for decades. He classified the entire incident as top secret, forbidden to be discussed with anyone outside that room. The reasoning was coldly practical. They couldn't have bomber crews believing German fighters might show mercy. It could lead to fatal hesitation in combat, to lowered guards that would cost lives. "You are not to speak of this to anyone," the officer commanded. "Not to other crews, not to your families, not even among yourselves. This incident never happened. Is that understood?" Charlie wanted to protest, This German pilot had saved their lives, had shown extraordinary courage and humanity. Didn't that deserve recognition? Didn't people need to know that even in the midst of total war, human decency could survive? But orders were orders. The 7 surviving members of Ye Olde Pub's crew were sworn to secrecy about the most extraordinary event of their lives. They would go on to fly more missions. Charlie would complete a full tour of 28 missions, but none would ever compare to that day over Germany when an enemy chose mercy over murder. The years passed like pages torn from a calendar, carrying Charlie Brown far from that December day in 1943. He completed his combat tour, survived the war, and returned to West Virginia to try to rebuild a normal life. He went to college on the GI Bill, rejoined the newly formed Air Force in 1949, and served until retiring as a lieutenant colonel in 1965. He worked for the State Department, making trips to Laos and Vietnam during another war, then retired to Florida where he became an inventor. But through all those years, through marriage and children, through career changes and cross-country moves, Charlie never forgot the German pilot who had spared him. The mystery haunted his dreams, nightmares, where he relived the terror over Bremen mixed with that surreal image of the Messerschmitt flying in perfect formation, the German pilot's salute before departing. For Franz Stigler, the years after 1943 brought their own journey. He survived the war, flying the new Me-262 jet fighters with Jagdverband 44, Adolf Gallen's elite squadron of experts formed from Germany's greatest aces. When Germany fell, Franz found himself in a destroyed nation, everything he had known in ruins. In 1953, he emigrated to Canada, settling in Vancouver, British Columbia, where he built a successful business. He never spoke of the incident with the B-17 to do so, even after the war could have brought reprisals from other German veterans who would view his actions as treasonous. It wasn't until 1986, more than 4 decades after the war, that Charlie Brown finally decided to break his silence. Speaking at a reunion called Gathering of the Eagles at the Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama, someone asked him about his most memorable mission. The story poured out the desperate fight over Bremen, the mysterious German escort, the salute that had haunted him for 43 years. The response was explosive. Some didn't believe him. The story was too incredible, too Hollywood to be real. Others were fascinated, wanting to know more about this German pilot who had defied everything they thought they knew about the enemy. But what frustrated Charlie most was that he still didn't know who the German pilot was or what had become of him. Charlie began a quest that would consume the next 4 years of his life. He searched military archives, both American and German, finding nothing. The incident had been so thoroughly classified that no official record existed. He wrote to German fighter pilot associations, describing the encounter, hoping someone would remember. For years, nothing came back but dead ends and false leads. Then Charlie tried one last approach. In January 1990, he wrote a letter to a newsletter published for former Luftwaffe pilots, describing the incident in detail, the date, the location, the markings on the German fighter, everything he could remember. He asked a simple question: "Do you know who saved my life?" 3 months later, a letter arrived at Charlie's Florida home with a Canadian postmark. Charlie's hands trembled as he opened it, reading the carefully typed words. "Dear Charles, all these years I wondered what happened to the B-17. Did she make it or not? I am so glad you made it. I was the fighter pilot who escorted you over the North Sea. My name is Franz Stigler, and I am writing to you from Vancouver, Canada. I have never spoken about that day, not even to my wife, but I have thought about it often. I saw your crew was terrified and wounded. I saw men trying to help each other. I could not shoot. It would have been the same as shooting men in parachutes. I tried to get you to land in Germany or fly to Sweden, but you would not, so I escorted you to the sea. I was glad when you left, because I knew you had a chance to make it home. Would it be possible for us to meet? After all these years, I would like to shake your hand. Your former enemy, today your friend, Franz Stigler." Charlie read the letter 3 times before the reality sank in. After 47 years, he had found him, or rather, Franz had found him. They arranged to meet on the 21st of June 1990 in a hotel lobby in Florida. Charlie brought a video camera operated by a friend to document the moment he had dreamed of for decades. When Franz Stigler walked into that lobby, Charlie knew him instantly. Despite the passage of nearly half a century, despite the grey hair and lined faces that time had given them both, Charlie recognized the man who had flown beside him that December day. They stood looking at each other for a long moment, two old men carrying the weight of history between them. Then Franz opened his arms and said simply, "Charlie." The embrace that followed was captured on video, two former enemies holding each other like long-lost brothers, both men's eyes filled with tears. Franz kept repeating, "I love you, Charlie," while Charlie could barely speak through his emotions. They spent hours talking that first day, filling in the gaps of 47 years. Franz explained his reasoning, his adherence to the code of honor he had learned from Gustav Rodel. Charlie described the aftermath, the crash landing, the classification that had kept him silent for so long. They discovered they had been living just 200 miles apart for years, Franz in Vancouver, Charlie in Seattle during part of his post-war career. From that day forward, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler became inseparable friends. They spoke on the phone every week, visited each other's homes regularly, took fishing trips together. Their wives, Jackie Brown and Ye Stigler, became close friends as well. They traveled across North America together, speaking at schools, veteran reunions, and civic groups, telling their story of humanity in the midst of inhumanity. In September 1990, Franz was invited to the reunion of Charlie's 379th Bomb Group. The surviving members of Ye Olde Pub's crew were their men whose lives Franz had saved. The reunion was emotional beyond description. Franz met the children and grandchildren who existed only because of his decision not to fire that day in 1943. As one veteran later described it, "From above it must have looked funny, the circle of people crowding around one small man in the center, hugging him and one another amid sounds of tears and laughter." Franz gave Charlie a book about JV-44, the unit of anti-Nazi pilots he had flown with at war's end. Inside he wrote, "In 1940, I lost my only brother as a night fighter. On the 20th of December, 4 days before Christmas, I had the chance to save a B-17 from her destruction, a plane so badly damaged it was a wonder that she was still flying. The pilot, Charlie Brown, is for me as precious as my brother was. Thanks, Charlie. Your brother Franz." The friendship between Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler became something deeper than most people ever experience. They had looked into the face of death together, had shared a moment of grace that transcended the madness of war. Their bond was forged not in the easy times of peace, but in the crucible of combat, where one man's mercy had saved another's life. In 2008, their remarkable journey came to an end. Franz Stigler died on March 22 at age 92 inches, Vancouver. Charlie Brown followed him on November 24 at age 86 inches, Miami. They had been friends for 18 years, but in a very real sense, they had been connected for 65 years, from that moment over Germany when humanity trumped hatred. Their story, kept secret for so long, has now become one of the most celebrated tales of World War II. Author Adam Makos captured it in his best-selling book, A Higher Call, ensuring that future generations will know about the day a German fighter pilot escorted an American bomber to safety. The Swedish metal band Sabaton immortalized it in their song No Bullets Fly, spreading the story to audiences worldwide. But perhaps the most important legacy of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler isn't found in books or songs. It's found in the simple truth they proved with their lives, that even in the darkest moments of human history, when violence and hatred seem to rule the world, individual choices for compassion and mercy can transcend the boundaries that divide us. Franz Stigler could have easily shot down Ye Olde Pub that December morning. It would have been perfectly legal, militarily appropriate, and would have earned him the Knight's Cross he desired. No one would have questioned it or thought twice about it. But he chose differently. He chose to see not an enemy but fellow human beings in distress. He chose mercy over glory, humanity over hatred, conscience over convenience. That choice rippled forward through time. It saved the lives of Charlie Brown's crew. It created families that wouldn't have existed, children and grandchildren who carry forward the legacy of that moment of grace. It gave the world a story that challenges our assumptions about enemies and warfare, about the capacity for good even in the midst of evil. When asked years later why he had done it, Franz Stigler's answer was simple but profound. "I saw humans in distress and I could not shoot. To me, It was just like they were in parachutes. I could not shoot them down. In the end, the story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler is a reminder that we always have a choice. Even in the most extreme circumstances, even when every external pressure pushes us toward violence and hatred, we retain the ability to choose compassion. Their friendship, born from an act of wartime mercy and nurtured through decades of peace, stands as proof that enemies need not remain enemies forever, that understanding can bridge the deepest divides, and that the human capacity for goodness can survive even the hell of war. The last time they were together, shortly before Franz's death, they sat quietly, two old warriors who had found peace with each other and with their past. They didn't need to speak much, their connection transcended words. They had travelled an impossible journey from that frozen December sky over Germany to a friendship that had healed both their wounds and given meaning to their survival. As Charlie Brown wrote after Franz's death, "Franz was my brother. He will always be my brother. On the 20th of December 1943, he gave me the greatest gift one human being can give another. He gave me my life. But more than that, he showed me that goodness can exist even in the worst of times, that enemies can become friends, and that the human spirit, when faced with the ultimate choice, can choose love over hate."